Team Fortress 2 was never meant to have a proper story. A game of its nature doesn't leave a lot of room for one on its own. It was released during a time where if you wanted to expand a game's story without making a sequel, a comic book adaptation was often the way to go. Whereas comic book adaptations of games often have a lot to derive from with the source material, however, TF2 does not have this luxury. TF2, or really any multiplayer-only game having comics made to expand on its world and tell a story, has always felt a bit off to me. Multiplayer games, while potentially having good art design, characters, and settings, usually don't have a story to go along with them. These aspects can help you feel more immersed in its world, but there isn't an overall arching plot to it all. You shoot the guy on the other team and
get on the freaking point, dumbass!
Maybe there'll be a surface level reason given as to why you're fighting the other team, along with some additional details, but beyond that there usually isn't much to it. Regardless, TF2 received many comics during its active development despite Valve initially saying that there wasn't room for TF2's story. Even former TF2 writer, Chet Falasek, said how a backstory was originally thought to not even be needed.
And that was just suggested not having a backstory, really. Of not trying to justify why there's 2 scouts in the world if there's 2 scouts. It's just the way it is. And people accept it, right? And that's always one of those learnings of like, you don't have to explain everything, just people accept it.
While in that same blurb they do say how the comics were the perfect way to explore the Merc's world, I still think they should have some resemblance to the game they're meant to be expanding upon. After all, wouldn't it be strange if there was a huge disconnect between the game's comics and the game itself?
Foreshadowing as a narrative device.
I understand that the comics are meant to add background to TF2's world and are essentially creating a new story, but it's still an adaptation of the game's characters and world. So with this video, I want to compare what TF2 started out as to the direction the comics went in, as well as its world as a whole. I'll be going through the comics in the order they released in, which includes the update comics alongside the mainline ones. With that out of the way, I'll get started. To answer the question of if TF2's comics are a faithful representation and adaptation of the game, we first need to go all the way back to how the game's world and setting was initially portrayed with its launch. The launch version of TF2 was a bit more deliberate with how it conveyed its world. There was a Cold War, spy thriller parody theme to it all, which could be seen through the game's original 6 maps. Starting with the 2 teams or corporations, the more rural and handcrafted looking style infrastructure of red is contrasted with the industrial and urban style look of blue. 2 overtly and comically different global superpowers conspiring against each other. They both have high-tech equipment in their bases, with computers, radars, machines, rockets, and overall exaggerated, retrofuturistic styled equipment. The 2 corporations attempt to hide their covert operations through various methods, such as disguising themselves as standard companies or services that best fit the location they are at. To any outsider, at a glance it would seem like there's nothing going on in these desolate places, but taking a closer look reveals that there's something more sinister taking place. Gameplay elements are also changed to enhance the world building, such as making the flag and capture the flag intelligence, giving each objective point a territorial name or purpose, and the administrator giving orders to each team. While it wasn't known who the administrator was initially, the fact that she's overseeing everything adds some espionage and deception to the conflict between the corporations. Due to the secrecy of this war, the classes in the game are hired mercenaries, trained killers who are here to complete work for their respective corporation. These details present ultimately make up the surface level explanation as to why the corporations are fighting. Red and Blue are in a secret war for global domination in which they are after each other's territory, information, and equipment in order to prevent the other side from taking over. The mercenaries are used to carry out their schemes, and the original description of the team matches the game's Cold War parody elements along with their mission statement. 9 mercenaries have come together for a job. It's the middle-ish part of a century a lot like the one we just had. A simpler time. There are 3 TV stations, 1 phone company, and 2 holding corporations that secretly control every government on the planet. Each corporation administers its half of the world with a multidisciplined army of paper pushers. For any problem lacking an obvious bureaucratic solution, mercenaries like these are contacted to address the situation through a massive application of force. The game was focused on portraying a large-scale war in secrecy, with a hint of irony and dubious intent. This storyline is definitely not as or even at all extreme or serious as other shooters of its era. The game still has humor in aspects like its characters, the operations of the corporations, and exaggeration with its gameplay mechanics, but its world has some level of integrity to it. I personally find this Cold War parody style to be compelling. While still not giving a definitive overarching plot by any stretch, this original premise would be interesting if expanded upon into comic form. It would be similar to the 60s style spy movies that the game's art direction and setting heavily resembles, and was inspired by. The wait for a comic form adaptation wouldn't be long, however, as only a little over a year and a half later, a comic was released alongside the Sniper vs. Spy update. It seems like Valve initially wanted to expand the storyline through maps added with updates, much like how we can see subtle hints towards his story in the original maps. Sniper vs. Spy marked a turning point with their approach to TF2's storytelling, however, and the over decade-long run of TF2's comics began. Though, just remember, this is only half of the story anyways. TF2's first comic, The Insult to the Meta-Drying Master out of Sniper, isn't actually the start of TF2's storyline. The comic is instead Sax and Hale's evidently unrealistic depiction of how the Dryad came to be. Manco hadn't been established yet, so this is really just a glorified in-universe advertisement rather than actually taking place. While not contributing to anything overall, this matches well with the tone of the game, both as an advertisement and from a thematic standpoint with the Dryad. For the comic itself, it is a parody of Charles Atlas's The Insult That Made a Man out of Mac, an advertisement present in real-world comic books near the time TF2 takes place. Charles Atlas's advertisements are all obviously exaggerated, just like many other aspects in TF2's world. The Dryad is also an exaggeration of a hunting technique. Hunters in real life use animal urine to deter animals away, which matches with how Sniper is the silent killer who may need a backup plan when things get too up close. Though instead of some biological fear response, it's the fact that the long-range class can always kill you in one swing. While throwing piss at someone is obviously absurd, it's still believable in TF2's world given the aforementioned real-world parallel, other improbable weaponry of the game, and the already being cartoonish concepts. Objects themselves having some grounding in reality, along with connecting with the characters' personalities, was a focus during development.
Once we had a handle on the art direction for our world and characters, we turned our attention to the weapons and gadgets. While these objects have some grounding in reality, they usually diverge in significant ways. For instance, the soldier's rocket launcher fits the general mold of a shoulder-mounted rocket launcher, but somehow manages to hold 4 rockets in a clip. To justify this and play up our stylized spy-tech fiction, we designed the weapons to look like customized pieces of hardware, personalized and modified by each character to suit his own ends. In keeping with the industrial theme of the game, we looked to 60s-era product design principles for our primary weapons, then focused on musical instruments for secondary and melee weapons, thinking these would reinforce the connection between the secondary items and each character's personality.
Moving on, the comic for the War update is when I would say Valve truly began giving background to TF2's world. Here we are introduced to the Administrator, or Helen as she's referred to, Miss Pauling, and the corporations of Manco and TF Industries. In correspondence with Manco, they turn Blue Soldier and Red Demo Man against each other through bribery with new weapons, despite their friendship, in order to prevent them from discovering what is really going on. The espionage and subversion between Red and Blue, as well as the government, aligns perfectly with the game. Something nefarious arising beneath the surface with how these companies are controlled matches with how Red and Blue operate, as well as with the spy thriller elements the maps focus on. Despite the previous comic not adding any main story, this comic builds off of it by emphasizing Hale's exaggerated portrayal of events. Hale talking to the reader and the pages themselves being more dirty, like an actual old comic book, makes it seem like these events didn't happen one-to-one. Now, I'm more so referring to the over-the-top events of Hale jumping out of the plane and crashing into the office, rather than the call itself, but this is still important to note. Something else to note is the Eyelander. The concept of the ancient, haunted, magical sword definitely strives a bit from TF2's setting. It leans more into fantasy rather than 60s warfare. A talking sword is pretty out there, and it doesn't clash well with the other weapons. Now, there was already a bow and arrow in the game at this point with the Huntsman, and medieval theming would really become an obsession later on. However, the Huntsman at least makes sense for Sniper's character with him being the long-range assassin. It's a bit hard to believe that the drunk explosives guy would wield a sword and shield, but overall though, a great comic. It's not canon. Like they just straight up say it. Still adds to Hale being this over-exaggerated character though. Before getting into loose canon, I first need to go over the last will and testament of Zephaniah Mann. This hidden page found in the Haunted Halloween Special Update gives us further background to the characters and motivations explored in this comic. I don't want to summarize too much in this video as I more so want to focus on comparing the tones and themes of the game to the comics, but, in short, we are introduced to the Mann family here. Zephaniah Mann, who is about to die to the amount of various conditions he has, gives the land he owns to his sons Plutarch and Redmond. The land is the unclaimed frontier of the Americas, which Zephaniah doesn't seem to value that much, with him describing the land as only having fool's gravel and a continent-sized parcel of sand. The land here being seen as useless or pointless, as well as the location itself, doesn't match the whole world domination and control storyline present. This contradicts earlier descriptions, motivations and operations, and the settings of maps themselves. As for the location, maybe I'm just obsessing over a minor detail here. It's fine if the comics and even the game itself want to focus on America, seeing as that is what the original development team was inspired by, but it's a bit inconsistent. Zephaniah says how the land is something of consequence to feud over, but this is more so him making his sons want to fight over the land, rather than actually having any value. The rivalry over this supposedly pointless land does fit the Cold War parody theme by critiquing past wars that could be seen as petty or unnecessary. However, it does disregard the original conflict described where it seemed like there were some actual stakes present in what they thought they were fighting over. Now, actually getting into the comic, Blue Engineer is brought into Blue Tark's headquarters to fix his life extender machine, which was built by Engineer's father, Mr. Conager, many years ago. Here we are filled in on the current status of the war between Blue and Red, with the battle having gone on for so long that the only way Blue Tark can win is by outliving Redman. Again, at this point it seems like some of the world building of the game has been completely ignored. No longer is this about some war for, on the surface to the corporations, control of the government and the world. I really think they could have kept the Endless War bit, but still have a focus on world domination. The feud still being present decades later is commenting on endless wars between countries, which does stay in line with the parody motifs, but the context for the war is a clear departure from what the original team and game were going for. So question answered. TF2's comics suck, and Moby Frankie's vision has been completely destroyed. But I think this is fine actually. This new reason for why the companies are fighting is still believable for TF2's satirical world. The importance of this land to their brothers is exaggerated, just like how the conflict is illustrated in the game. You could also argue that it fits with how the game works at a meta level, with there being thousands of rounds of TF2 played, and there never being a clear winner for either corporation. The map switches and you're on your way to PL Woodville event to question why you still play this game, and more importantly, you realize the outcome of the previous mission doesn't matter. Debatable if a comic adaptation should try to adhere to how a multiplayer game functions, but it's still something to take into account. The tone changed a bit with the stakes being lessened, but it's thematically consistent, and it's arguably more original than the initial premise. Going back to the comic, we learn that during Mr. Conker's efforts to build an immortality machine, he is met by someone who tells him about the existence of Australium, a seemingly all-powerful element that increases intelligence and ingenuity. Having some super material isn't that out there for TF2. There's teleportation, cloaking, and healing beams, but the believability falls off a bit with how it's portrayed. Australia and its residents seemingly having easy access to this material is a bit absurd, and it's just one big joke because of the material's name. It would make more sense for TF2's spy thriller world if Australium was this elusive material that only the people at the highest power knew about, rather than an entire fucking continent. This leans into being more absurd nonsensically than just an exaggeration of something. The war between the brothers is absurd, both with the life-extending machine, and the legitimacy surrounding it, but it makes sense with what the game is parodying. The reason for the existence of Australium does not, and goes too far in a few places. The comic ends with Blue Tark demanding Blue Engineer to fix his machine, with Engineer finding a document labeled Maps of Australium Caches while searching through his grandfather's notes. For just one comic, it changes a lot of pre-existing notions about the game's story and background. Perhaps that's why it's called Loose Cannon. There's not much to add about Bidwell's big plan. It's just another one-off update tie-in. Similar to the Apple comic and previous depictions of Saxton, his sections and comics are just overtly over the top because he is the one portraying his actions. They exist to entertain the reader, and aren't meant to be taken seriously since they're just stories he is selling. Other comics that pertain to the story aren't represented in the same way as Saxton's comics, with them being less stylized and not as bombastic. This creates a split of two types of comics, which while doesn't matter now, could become an issue later on if the line separating them becomes blurrier. Meet the Director is a step in the right direction. The basis of the comic is that the Director is being used by the Administrator to gather intel on Red's mercenaries in order to effectively blackmail them. The mercenaries catch on to the fact that something isn't quite right with them receiving personal photos, and the Administrator reveals that the photos were used to illustrate the dangers of discussing the terms of their contracts. Miss Pauline is also used in correspondence with the Administrator's plan by killing the Director at the end of the comic, along with hinting at a grander motive by arranging an interview with Blue's mercenaries. This is more like the war comic where the focus is on the surveillance of the mercenaries and the corporations, which fits the game's spy themes. Now, the focal point here is more on the mercenaries instead of the conflict. The war comic also did this, but that was more set on the content of the update rather than continuing a plot. This is the war-themed hat simulator, so I think the comic should focus on progressing the conflict, but the ending does tie back into the feud between Red and Blue and the Administrator being the one who is really pulling the strings. Dr. Gordbort's Crash Landing is a promotional comic for the Bison and Cow-Mangler, along with being an explanation to the rockets that crash landed in various maps before the update's release. There isn't much to say about the comic itself, but rather the concept of Dr. Gordbort's weapons. The idea of lasers and advanced technology does fit well with the various retrofuturistic equipment present within the game. Even the weapon designs themselves bear somewhat of a resemblance to what can be seen on maps like Gravel Pit. Issues arise with these weapons regarding believability, however. The super weapons and other advanced technology in the game are manufactured by the companies, rather than coming from some extraterrestrial power plant via... Hold on. Irregularities in the space-time fabric? What the fuck? Didn't they not want to do the whole invasion sci-fi style? No? Okay. Now is also a good time to look back at previous weapons added with updates. On top of the medieval weapons, at this point there was also the Shogun Pack, which added traditional Japanese weapons. While these weapons were promotional, some previous promo weapons still adhered to the time period of the game. The weapons don't have to be strictly American, as while the war in the comics takes place in America, the game takes place in several different locations across the globe, as per the whole world domination shtick. These weapons are not commonly used in different countries during the time TF2 takes place, however, and some just don't really seem plausible to exist within its world. The Fan of War and Half Satoichi also don't match the characters' personalities in any way. While not explicitly stated, a lot of the melee weapons are also objects that could be found lying around, or are related to the mercenaries' professions. I don't think I have to say why you aren't just going to find a katana laying around in CP Dust Bowl. The Contra comes close, as it is a
Sashimono
with a
Horagai,
which were both used for military tactics during feudal Japan. Weirdly, this is the first musical instrument for a secondary despite the connection being mentioned when the game was released, and the military aspect is also in line with Soldier on a surface level. But, again, it doesn't make sense for when the game takes place, and goes against Soldier being overtly patriotic and repulsive to anything that isn't American. The kunai is the only one out of the Shogun weapons that at least matches the class's personality fully, and is practical even for when the game takes place. If you want to place blame on the fact that these weapons are tie-ins to other games, then fair, but it's still a clear shift away from the setting of the game. My sentiments here also apply to true meaning, so I'll be skipping over that one. I'm lumping all of the Scream Fortress comics together because they all contribute to the same idea. The concept of magical wizards, talking cursed books, and giant floating eyeballs is pretty out there compared to what was in the game and storyline at the time. Even the first two Halloween updates were more tame compared to the direction Scream Fortress went in, going from haunted ghosts and undead forms of past Mann family members to completely new fantasy and Halloween-themed characters. Do I hate Scream Fortress? Hell no. I love the clusterfuck of spells and bosses. It's not even in the game year-round, and is perfectly acceptable as a once-a-month occurrence. For this reason, it doesn't affect the tone and theme of the game itself that much. However, it does affect the comics and the story. These outlandish fantasy scenarios and concepts are now taken seriously in the lore, rather than being fabricated by Saxon Hale or other characters for the sake of entertainment, or as some cover-up story. The reason for Demoman's other eye being missing is no longer because of a demolition incident, something which could be inferred from his character, and was also straight up stated, but is now because of a cursed book which a wizard keeps hidden away. Said wizard is now Soldier's roommate, even though I think Demoman would be a better candidate as per their close friendship shown in the war update. And there's something that pertains to the crux and entire theme of the game, which is set up in the next comic. After 100 years, Plutarch and Redmond propose a truce to what they now call a fruitless war. Previously, while the conflict portrayed in the comics was purely out of spite and effectively useless, due to the scale of the land and the administrator's control, the brothers still cared about the land they were fighting for and wanted a clear winner. If neither of them care now, then what's the point? Everything we've seen up to this point is about how the conflict itself and the circumstances surrounding it are absurd, but it's still treated seriously. You know, like what the game is about, with it being a Cold War parody. It doesn't make sense for both parties to suddenly stop caring when what they've been fighting for has gone on for so long. Their proposal is also completely nonsensical. To carry on the Mann family, they want to build a machine to get one of them pregnant. What? TF2's world was nonsensical within its setting, and with some bits of comical exaggeration. Not that everything was bizarre. These two companies fighting and building bases next to each other is illogical, but makes sense in the conflict that's portrayed. Sure, a life-extending machine is also a bit inconceivable, but it at least matches the themes of the game, as I previously mentioned. This, on the other hand, does not, and is just absurd for the reason of being absurd. Male pregnancy arc. Thank you, TF2 Wiki. While you may think that this proposal is just a one-off joke, and that TF2's world is somewhat still grounded in reality, we are then introduced to Greyman. Greyman could talk at birth, was taken away by an eagle, and then came back to civilization. He then states how the war is worthless, which is frankly true within the comic storyline since it's just a small part of America, and then points out how Manco is really what's worth fighting over. The brothers suddenly refute this by trying to justify the importance of gravel and the conflict, despite a few panels ago wanting to put an end to it, and then Greyman kills both of the brothers, with setting his sights on taking control of Manco. The motivations of the brothers being all over the place aside, this completely changes the direction of the story. Looking at the next two comics, it weirdly in a way goes back to the original 2007 premise of having world control. Though instead of it being an absurd war between the two corporations, it's now just Greyman against the Red Mercenaries. I specify red here because the blue team seemingly just ceases to exist. In a fate worse than chess, we can see the red and blue mercenaries are gathered by Miss Pauline to save Manco from Greyman, but in the Shadow Boxers, they are just gone? Strangely enough, Heavy appears blue in the thumbnail, but in the actual comic, him and everyone else are on red. Later on, TF2 writer Jay Pinkerton, someone who joined Valve after the game was created mind you, said that there are no clones and that there's only one of each mercenary. Which just isn't true though? Blue Team appears in the Meet the Team shorts and other comics, with those appearances clearly being clones rather than each mercenary being assigned to one team. Unifying the mercenaries into one team was likely done because of Man vs. Machine. In MVM, the mercenaries are all on red, but they still could have made it half red and blue instead. Not only did Blue Team appear in the comic for MVM 2 days before the update's release, but there were also other hints about Blue having a bigger role in the story, which would make sense for, you know, the game called Team Fortress 2. The importance of the teams are diminished even further with grave matters. Redmond and Blutarch become ghosts after dying, which in of itself is a contradiction. Blutarch says how there is nothing on the other side back in loose canon, but if you want to say that Blutarch is unreliable for whatever reason, we can see how death and spirits are treated in-game. Zephaniah and Silasmane aren't ghosts of their past selves in the maps they haunt, but rather they manifest into different forms. They don't have any resemblance of their living forms, unlike Redmond and Blutarch in the comics. Them calling their employers to send each other to hell is completely ridiculous, which while is a staple for Scream Fortress, the absurdity of these seasonal updates is now intertwined with the actual lore. Red and Blue are never mentioned again in a significant matter, now just being this running joke of how they are fighting beyond the grave. The spy thriller elements are gone because of how insignificant the corporation's hidden schemes are now. It's not a Cold War parody anymore since the battle for Manco is actually serious rather than the conflict itself and its parties being comical. And the overall somewhat grounded tones and themes of the game, along with their earlier comics, have been completely lost. The line was crossed, but the story isn't quite over yet. At long last, we have reached the mainline comics. There are a few more update comics after the mainline comics begin, but they are just update tie-ins and don't matter much to the story. The last few comics change the direction of the entire story, so what are we now left with? I am not going to go over the entire story, but the basic premise is this. Greyman finally takes over Manco, and Ms. Pauline tries to bring all of the mercenaries together to save the company. Greyman does so for the sake of taking their Australium, which now apparently is a life extension source. There is no Australium to be found, however, and the rest of the series focuses on the mercenaries and Ms. Pauline trying to find the last bits of Australium for the Administrator before Greyman does. Since any and all connection to the game's themes are lost with this new plot, the only thing left to compare is the tone of the mainline comics. While the previous two comics were more nonsensical, the game's world and earlier comics were, mostly, still somewhat grounded in reality. Any absurdity came from how ridiculous the conflict was, or from exaggerated weapon concepts. Not that any or all logic is absurd. The mainline comics throw this idea in the garbage, because, haha, we're the silly game now. The world becomes completely unbelievable and nothing makes sense anymore, both in the actions of the characters and the setting itself. The way Manco is taken over is silly. This is the entire essence of the plot and it's unbelievable. Locations and scenarios don't seem plausible. You have Soldier killing Tom Jones, an entire town of lead-poisoned idiots, the lost plane of Amelia Earhart, previously dramatized and fake events now being real, and New Zealand being encased in an underwater glass dome. Characters' actions are out of line. The idiocy and stupidity is ramped up immensely, with the justification for Soldier being the aforementioned lead poisoning, but this more so feels like the writer trying to compensate for flanderization. I'm not saying that all the mercenaries were always super smart, but they just act completely moronic compared to their previous depictions. Logic is also changed and becomes ridiculous. The biggest change is how Australium is used, with it being changed to this life extender material rather than for intelligence. Australium is the one part of the earlier comics that was conceptually absurd, but filled the role of some super secret material. It still fills that role here, but the intention of the brothers being the only ones able to extend their lives to fit what is being parodied is gone. Partially related to Australium is the fact that characters can seemingly just cheat death for whatever reason. Miss Pauline just has the blood put back into her, Medic tricks the devil to be revived, Scout has fucking plot armor, and most importantly, Zephaniah Mann is able to be revived by the Administrator because of Australium. This ultimately becomes the plot twist at the ending, despite Zephaniah Man already being dead in-game, and what constitutes death already being confusing. I do actually like this ending in its own right, but it just doesn't align with anything else. Other characters allude to there being a grander reason for the Administrator's obsession with Australium, but instead it's about a 100-year-old revenge story. It seems like this was not the initial plan for what the Administrator was doing with the Australium. Whatever reason mentioned in the Poopy Joe files doesn't surprise Miss Pauline, compared to the ending of the mainline comics where Miss Pauline is in shock of what happened. Really, I think it ending more in line with the game should have been that the brothers were still alive after all this time. Both corporations' mercenaries, along with the brothers, find out why none of them have been able to come out victorious. Discovering that this was also the Administrator could keep control of the government, world, country, or whatever they want to go with, indefinitely. None of that is funny, satisfying, or interesting to us. My brother in Christ, that is what the game is about. The ending and other moments in the comics are actually taken seriously, but it's hard for these events to have any weight to them because of how nonsensical the world is. The comics that were meant to be overtly preposterous and just fiction have been amalgamated with the actual story and its identity. That is what I ultimately think the problem with these comics are in relation to Team Fortress 2. I know I've stated this multiple times, but the conflict initially was silly because of how exaggerated it was, and later on, because of pettiness. Red and Blue's comical rivalry wasn't born for a crazy reason, it was because of a dispute in land. It would later on become this war that spans on forever, leading to the ridiculous lengths both corporations are willing to go to. The mainline comics weirdly switch this, where the precedence to everything is illogical, but the circumstances are serious. It's not a satire anymore, but its world is somehow less grounded than what it was trying to be overtly ironic. Believability was a focus when initially making TF2's world, but the modern writers of the game seem to disregard this philosophy. Wanting to put more focus on the mercenaries does not mean you have to throw continuity out the window. It's understandable how Red and Blue's rivalry turned into this ludicrous war due to the context of what the game is parodying, but none of the insane shit in the comics has any footing for happening. Irrationalness in one aspect does not equate to everything being incoherent and insane, and the Team Fortress 2 mainline comics are not that indicative of the game, Team Fortress 2. Oh, right. There's a game to all of this. Despite storyline content being jointed within the game, it doesn't really follow the story since the maps take place in several different international locations. However, the most recent content, both by Valve and the community, still stray away from the initial themes and tones of the game. The whole spy thriller setting and theme is sort of thrown aside, with maps not even attempting to adhere to the initial covert operations of the corporations. From amusement parks, to villages, to towns, and more, it can hardly be called discreet of how the corporations go about their business. Its world and tone are also less grounded in reality, with the multitude of mutated bread creatures, more extraterrestrial weapons and settings, ridiculous concepts, and Yetis just being able to manifest out of thin air. A person who played the game in its earlier years might think this all comes from a wacky community server, but no, this is actually in-game. This goes a step beyond just comical exaggeration, and was clearly not the developer's original intention. The game in a way followed the direction of its comics, with the world becoming less believable and more crazy, though at least to a much lesser extent compared to the comics. Team Fortress 2 Classified does a much better job at maintaining the initial themes and tones, while also expanding upon them with its new content. The maps feature the original spy tech and world domination equipment beneath inconspicuous buildings. The new weapons feature the exaggerated, yet grounded designs of the original ones. And the shady intent of the corporations is amplified with a new civilian class, with his role regarding the business side of how they function. This is currently my ideal and favorite version of TF2, due to the aforementioned thematic consistency, and also because of its server structure. I haven't played much of the live game since it came out. Now, you may be thinking, so what? Is it a bad thing that TF2, and more importantly to this video, its world and story, became more absurd? Am I wrong for liking the direction the story took? Isn't it better that the world took itself more unseriously so it stands out more? The answers to these questions are obviously up to you, but here's my 2 cents. I don't really like the direction the comics took. The changes made to the game's world, while still crazy, were not as striking compared to the comics, and it creates a big disconnect. I vividly remember playing the game for the first time, falling in love with it, and then going to check out the mainline comics. Even when I was younger, and would be more inclined to like a more absurd world and wacky story, I was baffled by the comics. I didn't think they were bad necessarily, but I also didn't feel like I was reading something that would come from Team Fortress 2. The problem isn't with the comics on their own, but rather how they are attached to the game and how they aren't a natural progression of what's portrayed. Why are the teams barely mentioned? Where does this Australian plot point come from and why is there so much focus on it? Why does nothing make sense? These are all thoughts I had when I first read the mainline comics, and looking back at the game and the initial update comics now, I don't think I was being entirely irrational. The problem with humor is that if it's done badly, it's amazingly destructive. My concern is that we'll overreach ourselves, and it being comedic will become absurd. But we seem to be developing our voice for comedy, along with a lot of other things. Hopefully we'll continue to pull it off.